Okay, right. So today we're going to do our first demo of creating a very simple pipeline using IOblend. IOblend consists of two components. The first component is the IOblend Designer, which is what we're looking at. This allows us to create, using a GUI, and drag and drop our individual components of our data pipeline. Once this has been created, this is stored as metadata, and the metadata, which describes our data pipeline, is then fired off to our IOblend engine. The IOblend engine then takes that metadata and dynamically creates data pipelines which run on Spark using the Spark framework and executes them. The reason why we use the Spark framework is because it's a well-established framework for creating very fast distributed computes. So it allows us to handle a large volume of data and to create very fast data pipelines. So without further ado, let's go in and create our first pipeline. So what we're looking at the moment, is IOblend Designer. So it consists of this main screen here, which is the designer window where we can drop components. And on the right-hand side is what we call the playbook component summary. So every single playbook will have a series of key value pairs, which allows us to enter the metadata, which IOblend Designer will capture and then fire off to IOblend Engine when we want the pipeline to be executed, which will then translate it into a data pipeline dynamically. Before we can actually create a data pipeline is actually stored as a data pipeline project. So for a new data pipeline, the first thing we need to do is actually create a data pipeline project configuration file. And the way we do that is by going to config, going to project run parameters, and then create new. So let me expand this. So as you can see here, it's a table which consists of a number of key value pairs, which is used by the IOblend project to denote runtime parameters for the whole of the data pipeline. The first one, now we don't need all of these parameters to be entered for a very simple pipeline. A lot of these parameters are specific to certain components. So for example, JDBC mapping and JARS file are specific to JDBC. So if you've got a data pipeline which is not using a JDBC component, then you don't need to fill those in. But starting from the top for our project, which is going to be a simple pipeline which connects to a S3 file source, then we'll enter just the bare information we need for that. So the first one is the location of the pipeline. So you enter in where on your local system, where your designer is running from, where the pipeline is going to be stored. Okay, so I've entered a directory path here. The next one is epochs. So the way IOblend works is a data pipeline consists of a number of components. So they are source, transforms, and sinks. So you can have a number of sources, a number of transforms, and a number of sinks. And the way it works is each one of those components has what we call a run order. And the way the pipeline is executed is it executes each component with respect to that run order. So if I've got run order 1 to run order 7, components will run in the order of 1 to 7 ascending. Once the data pipeline has gone from 1 to 7, it will then go back to 1 and rerun that. And once it goes back to the beginning to rerun it, so let's say it goes back to 1, which is pulling data from the source again, it's classed as it's done one epoch or one iteration. So you can define from a development standpoint how many times you want your cycle to run. You can enter 0, which means it will run indefinitely, which is what you do if it's a streaming job. Or from development purposes, you can put just a number of epochs in there, which allows you to automatically get it to shut down without running continuously. So I will put 3 in here just to start off with. Debug. So if I'm running this as an interactive data pipeline from IOblend Designer, so I can test it by looking at the output. If I set debug to true, then it will generate certain messages for me and give me certain features. And those features are predominantly around the running of the iteration. So as I've just described, the epoch determines how many times a data pipeline will rotate around an iteration. What a debug will do is if debug is set to true, it will give you the ability to either start or stop or restart that cycle, which is quite important. And you'll see why it's important as we go through our first example today. So let me just set that to true. I want those messages. Pipeline name, we're going to call it D2. State directory. So when IOblend engine is executing, then it creates temporary data which it uses internally to maintain state. In order to do that, sometimes it needs to write that state out. So we need to provide a directory for IOblend to use to write that data out. Typically what we do is we will create IOblend state, or we create the state in the folder that the project is in. And I should mention, when you look at pipeline location, what I've done is I've created a folder called Demo02. Demo02 represents the IOblend project that we're creating, and Playbooks is the folder name that we'll be dropping the pipelines that we're generating into here. So for the state directory, you will use a folder structure based upon the project and then postfix state. You can call it anything you want, but just as good practice, we tend to call it state. So therefore it's consistent through all data pipelines which have been generated, which makes life a little bit easier when it comes to searching for and reusing data pipelines across the enterprise. And the last things that we need to do here is run interactive. So if I'm running it from IOblend Designer and I want to see the data which has been generated and I want to see the various stages as I'm interactive running it, I have to set run interactive to true. Otherwise, if I'm running this in production, then this will be set to false. File system is local. Spark master, we leave that as local for the time being. Spark master represents the resource manager that Spark will be using. So obviously, if we're running this on a Spark instance, then you would actually specify, for example, Yarn or Kubernetes or Mesos. Interaction by file, we'll set that to true. In order for IOblend to interact with the engine, it uses an interaction file. So if we're running this interactively, then we, from the IOblend Designer, then we need to set that to true. IDF location. So the IDF location is actually the interactive debug file location, which is related to the interaction by file. So because we are running interactively, we need to give it a place where it can find it. So again, let's copy the project directory. And we will create an interactions folder. IOblend will automatically create these folders for you. Run parameter path. So these parameters which are being generated here are then stored as a JSON file. I should mention that all of the metadata which is being generated by IOblend, which is then used by IOblend engine to create the data pipelines, is stored as JSON files. So again, we'll give it a location. So again, it will be stored in the data pipeline project folder. We will create a folder within that called config, where all our configurations will be stored eventually. And that's it. And that's the only thing that we need to create for our initial pipeline for setting up the data pipeline project. So if I go and save that, that's now done. Now that's done, I can now go ahead and start creating our first pipeline.